Story number 1. The Library's Whispering Isle. Greystone High had an old library tucked into the farthest corner of campus. Though it housed rare books and artifacts, students rarely visited. The dim lighting, towering shelves, and ever-present smell of mildew gave the space an oppressive air. But what truly kept people away was the rumor. The Whispering Isle. Everyone knew the story. It was said that the last row of shelves, hidden in the shadows at the back, was cursed. If you stood there long enough, you'd hear faint whispers calling your name. Some students claimed they saw shadows that didn't belong to them, flickering just out of sight. Others said those who stayed too long disappeared, leaving nothing behind but an open book. Emily didn't believe in curses. When her English teacher assigned a paper on rare literary works, she saw it as an excuse to explore the infamous library. "You're not really going to that place, are you?" her friend Mia asked, eyes wide. "Why not?" "I need a good grade," Emily replied, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "But the Whispering Isle." "It's just a stupid story," Emily said with a shrug. The library was colder than Emily expected. She rubbed her arms as she walked past rows of dusty shelves, her footsteps echoing in the silence. The librarian, an elderly woman with sunken eyes, barely glanced up as Emily passed the desk. "Don't stay too late," the woman murmured. Emily found her way to the back of the library where the Whispering Isle supposedly lay. The air grew heavier, the smell of old paper and something faintly metallic growing stronger. When she turned the corner into the last row, she hesitated. It felt darker here, the shelves taller and closer together. The books seemed older, their spines cracked and faded. She scanned the titles, running her fingers along the dusty edges until she found a book that caught her eye. The Forgotten Voices. The moment she pulled it from the shelf, a soft whisper tickled her ear. "Emily." She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. The whisper came again, faint but insistent. "Emily." It seemed to come from behind her. She spun around, but the aisle was empty. "Get it together," she muttered to herself, clutching the book. She turned back to the shelf to replace it, but the titles had changed. Instead of the dusty classics she'd seen before, the books now bore names she recognized. Emily's Secrets, Emily's Fears, Emily's Mistakes. Her hands trembled as she flipped through one. The pages were blank at first, but as she stared, words began to form, scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Why didn't you help me?" She dropped the book, the sound echoing through the aisle. The whispering grew louder, overlapping voices now, each one calling her name or asking questions. "Do you remember me? Why did you leave? Stay with us." The air turned frigid, her breath visible as she backed away. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, darting between the shelves. She turned to run, but the aisle stretched impossibly long, the exit nowhere in sight. "Stop it!" she screamed. The voices fell silent. A figure stepped out from the shadows at the end of the aisle. It was a girl, her face pale and familiar. Emily's heart sank. Megan. Megan had been her best friend years ago, but she died in a car accident. Emily had always blamed herself for not being there that night. "You left me," Megan said, her voice echoing strangely. Her eyes were hollow, her expression both sad and accusing. I didn't mean to," Emily stammered, tears streaming down her face. "Stay with me," Megan whispered, stepping closer. The shadows around her deepened, stretching toward Emily like living tendrils. Emily turned and ran, her screams drowned out by the chorus of whispers that filled the aisle. When she reached the main library, everything went still. The shelves were normal, the air warm again. She looked back, but the Whispering Isle was gone. Her hands were empty. The book she'd been holding had vanished. But later that night, as she unpacked her bag at home, she found a single page tucked inside. Scrawled in jagged letters were the words, "You can't run forever." Story number 2. The chalkboard message Cedar Valley Middle School had been closed for years. Its crumbling walls and shattered windows stood as a reminder of the mysterious fire that had consumed half the building one stormy night. Whispers claimed the fire wasn't an accident, that something sinister had happened in room 6B. When Jamie and her friends decided to sneak into the abandoned school for a thrill, she didn't believe the stories. "It's just an old building," she said as they climbed through a broken window. "People love to make up ghost stories about places like this." Her friends, Marcus and Lily, followed hesitantly. their flashlights casting eerie beams across the dusty hallway. "Let's find room 6B and prove there's nothing scary," Jamie said confidently. The school smelled of mildew and smoke, and every creak of the floorboards seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. As they passed rusted lockers and faded posters, Lily kept glancing over her shoulder. "I swear I heard something," she whispered. "Relax," Jamie replied. "It's just the wind." But when they reached room 6B, even Jamie hesitated. The door was partially open, its wood scorched and warped. Inside, the air felt colder, and the faint smell of burned paper lingered. The room was just as they'd imagined. Overturned desks, shattered windows, and an ancient chalkboard still mounted on the wall. "What now?" Marcus asked, his voice echoing. Jamie grinned. "Let's see if the ghost left us a message." She grabbed a piece of chalk left on the teacher's desk and scrawled across the board. "Are you here?" They waited, holding their breath. Nothing happened. "See, it's all just—" The chalk moved. Jamie dropped the chalk as it began writing on its own, the sound of scraping filling the room. "Leave now!" Lily screamed, grabbing Jamie's arm. "It's just a trick," Jamie insisted, her voice shaking. "Someone's messing with us." The room grew colder, their breath fogging in the air. The chalk moved again, faster this time. "You don't belong here." "Let's go," Marcus said, backing toward the door. But when they turned to leave, the door slammed shut. The lights on their flashlights flickered, then went out entirely. The darkness was suffocating. "Jamie!" Lily cried, gripping her hand. "I'm here," Jamie said, trying to sound calm. A faint glow appeared on the chalkboard. Words were scrawling rapidly now, overlapping and frantic. "Stay, burn, stay, burn, stay." "Why is it saying that?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible. Jamie turned back to the room, her flashlight flickering weakly to life. That's when she saw them. Figures stood at the back of the classroom, shadowy and faintly glowing. They were children, their faces blurred, their clothes singed and tattered. "They're the kids," Lily whispered, trembling. "The ones who didn't make it out of the fire," Jamie realized. The children stared at them silently, but their eyes, hollow and glowing faintly red, seemed to burn with anger. "We have to go," Marcus shouted, lunging at the door and pulling with all his strength. The chalkboard screamed, the sound like nails on glass, as new words appeared. "You can't leave." The desks began to move, screeching across the floor. One by one they slid toward the door, blocking their exit. Jamie grabbed the chalk and scrawled desperately on the board. "We're sorry." For a moment, the room stilled. The figures blinked out of existence, and the door creaked open. "Go!" Jamie shouted, shoving her friends toward the hallway. They sprinted through the school, the sound of whispers following them, until they burst through the window they'd entered. The next day, Jamie returned alone. She had to know if it had been real or just their imaginations. Room 6B was empty, the chalkboard clean. But as she turned to leave, she noticed faint writing on the board, as if etched by invisible fingers. "You shouldn't have come back." Story number 3. The Substitute. The day the substitute teacher arrived, the atmosphere at Fairview High School changed. Ms. Halstead had retired the previous week, and the students in her history class were relieved to hear she wouldn't be replaced by someone stricter. But when Mr. Grayson walked in, the room fell silent. He was tall and thin, with unnaturally pale skin and icy blue eyes that seemed to see right through you. He wore a perfectly pressed suit, and his voice was calm, but unsettlingly deep. "I will be your instructor," he said, his gaze sweeping over the class. "Let us begin." At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for the way Mr. Grayson taught. He didn't use textbooks or notes. Instead, he spoke about historical events as though he had been there. When discussing wars, he described the sounds of battle in vivid detail. When covering the Great Fire of London, he recounted the smell of burning timber and screams of the fleeing crowds. "You have a great imagination, sir," one student, Kelly, said nervously. Mr. Grayson turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Imagination? I assure you, Miss Kelly, I speak from experience." The class laughed uneasily, but Kelly swore she saw a flicker of anger in his gaze. Over the next few days, strange things began happening. One morning, a student named Derek was late. Mr. Grayson paused mid-lecture as Derek slipped in, trying to avoid attention. "Do you know the consequences of tardiness?" Mr. Grayson asked, his voice unnervingly calm. Derek stammered an apology, but Mr. Grayson only smiled and continued teaching. The next day, Derek didn't show up to school. His friends said he'd been texting about a strange nightmare the night before, something about being locked in a room full of shadows that whispered his name. More students began having nightmares. "I saw him in my dream," Kelly whispered to her friend Sarah. "Mr. Grayson, he was standing at the foot of my bed, just staring at me." Sarah shook her head. "That's crazy. He's just a weird teacher. That's all." But later that week, Sarah didn't come to school either. Jamie, the class president, decided to confront Mr. Grayson. "Where are my friends?" she demanded after class, her voice shaking. Mr. Grayson tilted his head, his cold blue eyes locking onto hers. "Perhaps they didn't take their lessons seriously," he said. By the following Monday, half the class was absent. Those who remained noticed strange changes in Mr. Grayson. His eyes seemed brighter, almost glowing in the dim classroom. His voice grew colder, and the temperature in the room felt like it dropped whenever he spoke. Jamie found a notebook in the back of the classroom, abandoned by Sarah. Flipping through it, she found frantic scribbles. "He's not human." "Don't look into his eyes." "He knows your fears." Jamie's blood ran cold. She looked up and found Mr. Grayson staring at her, his lips curling into a faint smile. That night, Jamie couldn't sleep. Every shadow in her room seemed to stretch and move, and faint whispers echoed in her ears. "You shouldn't have asked questions," a voice hissed. She turned on the light, but the whispers didn't stop. Her phone buzzed on her nightstand. A text appeared on the screen. "History repeats itself." The next morning, Jamie didn't go to school. The school principal announced that Mr. Grayson had completed his temporary assignment and wouldn't be returning, but the students who had gone missing were never found. Years later, an old photo of Fairview High surfaced online. In the background, standing among a group of students, was a man in a perfectly pressed suit with icy blue eyes. The caption read, "Class of 1924." Story number 4.